Hello, welcome back to Sterling Armory's Oakeshott Typology series, where we're talking about everything related to the Oakeshott Typology. Today's episode is on, I think it's episode 7, but we're on type 19, which is a very interesting type, I think, although it doesn't get much attention today. Real quick, if you're new to our channel, we're Sterling Armory. We're a bunch of guys who like to drink a lot of mead and make blades, and catch us on our Sword Talk podcast. That we also have on this channel, and how it's made if you want to see how we make our blades, and lots of fun stuff there. So real quick, before we go any further, if you're familiar with or if you watched our Oakeshott Typology series before, you know our sources, but for everyone new, we have two main sources directly from Oakeshott himself. And real quick, the Oakeshott Typology is just a way to categorize medieval blades, because there's so many different types. This is a very easy way to kind of put them in a relative time period and design and use case. For it's a good way to classify blades based on that. So that's why it's very common today, because it's easy to say, oh, I want a type 10 or a type 12, and the maker usually knows what you're talking about. So real quick, first book is The Sword and Age of Chivalry, which is his first book, which describes everything about the typology and why he did the class types that he did. And then the second book is Records of the Medieval Sword, which is basically it came out much later, and there is some changes in the typology between the two as he develops it. And that's the records is basically just a big group of images of original pieces that fit in each type. And then our third resource is My Armory, the website. If you're not familiar with them or haven't been on there, it's a great forum, a lot of information all brought together into one place. And I love using it because they take, in the features section, you'll see there's a couple different Oakeshott features that they have on their page. And they really organize all this data into very accessible, very easy to click on and navigate pages. So highly recommend that. And support them if you can. We're not linked to them or anything, but they're such a great resource for the whole community. So type 19, I think. So type 19, I think, is very, at least in my experience, is very underrepresented in modern sword makers. There are a few that are made, but they're not that common. Although the more you study about type 19s, you realize, wait a minute, these blades are very common. There's a lot of them in museums, and there's a lot of pieces going back to the 80s when we were watching movies, like those blades and a lot of the wall hangers that we had in the 80s. They're all designed off of type 19s, although we may not realize they were type 19s at the time, nor now. But when you look at the blades that are type 19s, like, oh, that looks familiar, and that's what that wall hanger was based on back in the 80s. So. Yeah, like in my 20 years of making blades, I've never had a commission for a type 19. So interesting. But let's take a look at them and see why that may be, and just do an overall discussion. So another interesting thing I think is that Oakeshott himself this is just a personal guess based on reading all of his works. I think he was really interested in early to mid-century medieval blades. I think the later century blades, I don't think he was as interested in. And the reason why I say that is, so if you look at the original book, The Sword and Age of Chivalry, type 19 only has basically 1.5 pages of description. That's it. Every other type has a lot of description. And this one only has 1.5 pages. So there's not much describing there. And I think when he gets to the later, like originally when he wrote this, I think when he started to get to the later time period blades, I think he just started losing interest. Maybe that's not the case, but it kind of seems that way. So real quick, what is a type 19? So before I read from his description here, most type 19s, and the reason why we see a lot in museums is because they're very prevalent in 16th century and newer. So there's a lot of them. When plate mail starts to go away, you start seeing a big rise in type 19 blades. Not sure why that's the case. It could be, that they're just a great general purpose blade. It could be that they're probably easier to manufacture for the types of manufacturing methods they were using at that time. Don't know. But there's a lot of them that pop up in the 16th century. So after the 1500s, you start seeing a ton of them. Now, there are some that they found. In fact, when he originally wrote this book, he didn't think they existed prior to the 1500s. But in researching them, he found actually each of the ones that he found that were early all came pre-1500. One even dates back to 1340, I think. So it's pretty old. And I think that might have sparked his interest so that when we go to the second book, he gets more detail. But also note in the first book, Type 19s are only single-handed. He says that they're only single-handed blades. That changes in his second book where he brings in some longswords. So let me just read his description here. So Type 19 is marker's in my way again. Type 19 is a broad, flat blade, and the edges running nearly parallel, and to a sudden sharp point. And then it has a narrow, weld-molded fuller and the upper third. And then the section for the majority of the blade is a flat hexagon, and the edges are very clearly chamfered. So similar to like a 16A when we had that conversation, but 16A has edges that taper to a point instead of being parallel. So that's the big difference here. Now, the other distinguishing feature of this blade is there is a well-made ricasso about 2.5 to 3 inches long. Now, when he says that, he's talking about the single-hand versions. But remember, that's all that exists in this book. And he says the grips are type flat, quite short. And yeah, so that's really about it. He just goes into a bit more descriptions on the older ones that they found. So all the old versions that you'll see examples of, I'll have them here as well as in the books, are from the Alexandria Arsenal. So it seems like everything pre-1500 that's a Type 19 blade. It almost seems like they were made all from the same factory, even though there's a span of 100 years. 1340-ish all the way up to, I think the latest one was 1450 or something like that, and even later, so it's more than 100 years. But they all seem to be made by the same group. Obviously, that's not the same person because of the span of time there. But they all have the same Arabic inscriptions where that little ricasso is. Fullers are nearly identical. Everything looks like it's made from the same place. Not sure if that's been proven or not, but it just seems that way. Now, after 1500, you start seeing this blade shape become a lot more popular across the board. So in Germany, in Italy, in England, Ireland, Scotland, it starts going all over the place. Now, again, why that is, I think it's just a good general blade shape. It's a very basic blade shape. It's not great as a cutter or great as a thrusting blade. It's a good combination of both, I guess, although I wouldn't think they'd be great thrusting blades. But so when we go into the records, again, he starts bringing in longswords into the group as well. So let's take a look at some of the images. I have some right from the books, and then I have some of pieces that are in the books, but I also got a chance to personally see and take pictures of as well. So let's pop those up. So let me switch. Here we go. So if you look at these blades, if you think back to what I mentioned earlier, if these look familiar to you, it's because they're very common blades. I think that a lot of us grew up with if you watched movies in the 80s. However, we just didn't know what they were at the time, and they weren't used properly for the most part. So, but you'll see the short ricasso, especially in that center blade there. And then the short fuller, it's about the first third of the blade, and they usually have some detailed line work around the fuller as well, and in the ricasso. And that same design is common on each of these. Now, I mentioned they're not very well represented in the modern makers, but there are a couple. So I think Albion has one or two, and then LK Chen it came out a couple years ago, but they're usually known for making Chinese blades and making pieces off of museum pieces. But they work with Matt Easton, and they're reproducing the one on the far right there, which I believe is out of the Royal Armories. And I've seen that. I have pictures of that one as well, although I don't think I have my personal pictures of that one here. So it's going to be great to see that when it comes out. And it might already be out. I'm not sure. But that's a great example that you can get today. So let's jump to the next images. So here's the one that I think everyone will recognize. So the Type 19s, again, I mentioned they start getting pretty popular after the 1500s. So a lot of side sword blades fall into this category. They have that short ricasso. They have a slightly complex guard. and they have those parallel edges going all the way down. So the lower image there, that's the one I think everybody knows, right? That's what the El Cid sword was based off of from the 80s. I think everybody who owned a sword had a version of that at some point. And it's a very common blade in iconography. Like if you see images of swords, a lot of people think of that one immediately. That's a Type 9. The original one is a Type 19. And Oakeshott kind of uses that as kind of the standard bearer for the Type 19s. So yeah, you might see some recreations of that. I don't know if anyone actually makes an actual historical version of that other than the wall hanger versions that we've seen. There might be somebody that does, but I'm not sure off the top of my head. Those are very common Type 19s, and they become very prevalent. And then, so in the second book, I swear this is kind of where I think Oakeshott kind of gets a little blurry, and maybe he didn't really know himself exactly what a Type 19 longsword would be. Because in the prior books, both of these would have been Type 17s, which is funny because when I talked about Type 17s in our last video, or 2 videos ago, I mentioned that there's nothing really like a Type 17. They're very unique. Well, I guess Type 19s are like Type 17s. I still would say that bottom sword is a Type 17. I'm not sure why he puts that as a 19, but he does. So the top one, yeah, the edges are a bit more parallel on that, so that makes more sense. I'm actually surprised. So we haven't got to Type 20s yet, but that also could be a Type 20. So I'm not sure why he puts that in the Type 19. But that's what he's in his records of the medieval sword. That's what, for example, 9 and 10 that you see there, that's his Type 19. Now I do have some better examples of Type 19s that are clearly Type 19s coming up here, but let's jump back to some images. So here's my actual photographs from the Met of the various blades you saw on those first few pictures. So if you go to the Met now, I believe this is how the Met's current layout is set up, although it does change somewhat often. So the first time I went to the Met, it was actually a bit different. The horizontal blade wasn't there, and then the vertical blade hanging up to the right wasn't there. But both of those were added, and both of those are Type 19 blades. So it seems like they got either they got a few more from the Alexandria arsenal, or they had them in the back before and just didn't have them on display, which is probably the case. But we're looking at basically the 3 main Type 19s that Oakeshott uses in a description. So if you look at the left image there, again, the horizontal one is one of the famous Type 19s. And then it's hard to see because my pictures have glare in them, but the third one from the left, or the second one from the right there, that's also one of the popular Type 19s that dates back a lot older. And then if you look all the way to the right, there's one vertically hanging there as well. So each of those is listed in the Oakeshott's records of the medieval sword book. So if you get to the Met, highly recommend it. So, and then the Wallace collection, again, these are my own photos. If you guys, I always have a hard time photographing in museums with glass because I always get glare. If you know of a way to photograph those and removing the glare, please let me know. I'm terrible at it. And these are much older pictures. Last time I was at the Wallace collection was prior to COVID, so these are from them. But the Wallace collection has a lot of Type 19s in the hand and a half and longsword variety, and there's 3 of them that you can see there. And so if you're ever in London, highly recommend the Wallace collection. And then this is one at the Wallace. I think this would be a Type 19. This is my favorite in their collection. I don't think I've seen anyone ever actually make this piece or replicate it. But I've been wanting to make it, and if I ever get back to doing complex guards, this is probably the first one I'm going to make. But I did a pretty detailed study on this blade. The reason why I think it may not be a Type 19 is it doesn't have that ricasso that most of them have, but every other feature of this blade, parallel edges, the fuller dimension, everything else is a Type 19, other than not having a ricasso. So maybe it wouldn't be because of that, but I still think it would be. So one thing I don't hear a mention of often is, and I don't know if anyone's classified these as a Type 19, but they fit the description. So it has that short ricasso, it has that short fuller in the first third, and the edges are parallel going to that same tip. So a lot of the later claymores, like this is the example in the Met, I believe would also fit into a Type 19 blade. And again, I don't know if anyone else has, maybe there's been a discussion on that already, but I personally haven't seen that. But I would say that that's what he classifies as a Type 19. On top of this, almost all the Irish ring hilts that I've seen, not all, actually, a lot of the Irish ring hilts that I've seen over in Dublin, they're all in that same blade shape. So I think the ones that Albion makes, I think are two. I think they make two different Irish ones, although I don't know if they're still available. But I believe they were Type 19s, and one in a longsword variety and one in an arming sword variety. Maybe they do still make them. I don't recall. Those are great examples, the ones that are over there, and yeah, a lot of the blades I saw in Ireland, and then the ring hilt examples I saw in Scotland, also had that same blade shape. So again, these are all blades after 1500, right? So that blade shape seems to be very popular. And yeah, I think so. Those are all the images I have, and that's the Type 19. So again, if you weren't familiar with the Type 19 before, hopefully you are now, and hopefully, or maybe you were very familiar with the type, but just didn't realize they were Type 19s. So again, they're not very common today. I don't know of any that are actually used in HEMA, like for sparring or for cutting at the moment, other than side sword. So side sword is getting pretty popular in HEMA, and because of that, I think we'll start seeing more Type 19s in that variety, and maybe they'll start getting more popular. I guess we'll see how the LK Chen version comes out, the new one. If that does pretty well, I think you'll see more of them. And I believe Albions are doing well. So yeah, I have not. I made one a while ago, but I haven't made one in a while, just because they don't sell that well. So yeah, that's a Type 19. And thanks for joining us on this video. And please catch us on our YouTube page, on our Facebook, Instagram, all those things. Like and subscribe, share the video, and if you have any questions, please comment below, join the conversation, and we will catch you next time. Thanks.